Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicoast. We're recording this on June 29th, 2017, and this is episode 41. Politicoast is a podcast that explores what's happening in British Columbia and across the country. If you haven't already, please make sure to subscribe and leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter where we're at PoliticostPod. Please support the show at patreon.com/Politicoast.
I'm Scott.
And I'm Ian. It's just after 8:30, and right now we're recording the first segment of the show. We recorded our second segment an hour and a half ago, and we recorded the last quick take spit just before that. And the reason we did all that is so that we can give you segment one, the confidence game, confidently, because we know what's happened finally about 5 minutes ago. So the obvious news is that John Horgan is the new Premier of British Columbia. This was announced after he was invited to the Lieutenant Governor's house, after Christy Clark left the Lieutenant Governor's house, after she lost a confidence vote earlier this afternoon. But maybe let's throw it back to Monday in our little time machine and just sort of run through what exactly happened this week, because this was quite the week of jiggery-pokery, as Green MLA Sonia Furstenau described it.
So on Monday, the NDP put forward a confidence motion attached to the throne speech, and that was finally voted on today. But in terms of the more interesting aspects of what happened Monday was the Liberals coming out swinging with a campaign finance reform bill before the debate really had even started on the throne speech. And specifically, this one would have significantly dropped the cap on personal donations down to, I believe...
Well, it would have created one.
Yeah. Would have gone from infinite to 2,500 and change, and as well as ban corporate and union donations, put caps on third-party spending and allowable donations to third parties too. And this has kind of been on the opposition's wish list for a long time, and they voted it down.
Interestingly, this was the first time in BC legislative history that a government bill has not passed first reading. I think even in a typical minority situation, you usually pass first reading so that you can at least debate the bill. Because I think this is a bill that could have been debated. The corporate union donation bans and a lot of that stuff I'm all on board with. The exact number of the personal allowance, I would have gone lower, and that'd be something you'd debate. I have a lot of reservations about how it was putting a lot of weird restrictions on third parties. Like, it put donation limits on third parties, which is not something that's done anywhere else that I know of. You can still donate as much as you want to charities or nonprofits that are involved in election campaigns at the federal level or in other provinces. But this would have said there would have been a, $1,000 donation limit, which can really fuck with fundraisers. But we don't need to get into that debate because that bill died, because the NDP and Greens got together and said on Monday, we're not playing your fucking games. And that became even more important when the Liberals introduced their second bill, or it might have been the other way around, I don't know exactly, to recognize the Green Party as an official party caucus. This would have given them extra resources, recognition, and just, it was on their wish list. And it was sort of killing that really crystallized that, the Greens and NDP are sort of on the same playbook this week, and they stuck to it.
I think this was maybe a more risky move than it needed to be. On one hand, it did send a very strong signal that, we're just wanting to right for the throne speech and the confidence vote, and, let's get a government that has confidence before we start introducing bills. But at the same time, it's never a great look when any party votes down kind of some of their signature platform pieces. And, I think it's worked out for them. It might have been better to go for just kind of a delay to, the vote was going to happen today, regardless of what happened with these bills. And, maybe some legislative procedural shenanigans to kind of push those out till Friday or whatever, in which case, now you have a new government, you can introduce new bills or change them or play around with them enough that it's no longer the case where it has to be the situation where you're publicly saying, no, those things I've campaigned on, we're not doing them.
Well, and one interesting thing I saw on Twitter, because the constitutional experts this week were in hyper overdrive. They've been busy the last few weeks. But one rule in the BC legislature is you can't reintroduce the same bill in a session, or substantially the same bill. I think they can get around that by proroguing, and it sounds like Horgan will just prorogue to reset before he even calls the first throne speech. But it sort of almost ties their hands a little bit that they can't just straight up introduce these bills. That's getting into the wonky procedural stuff.
And yet another reason why it might be just an idea to throw a whole bunch of amendments on it and kind of basically rewrite the bill in committee.
I guess the other thing we learned on Monday was that it was going to not be a civil, everyone working together kind of week. That first question period was pretty raucous, with the Liberals talking up how they'd made all these concessions and the opposition parties going, nope, we don't trust you, time to go. When will you get out of the way and let us govern? That just went through all week right up until this afternoon. And I think the other thing we saw was Clark talked about letting things play out on Monday, but her version of letting the throne speech play out involved basically filibustering it, basically putting up as many MLAs to speak to it as she could to drag this out till Thursday. Because there's no reason we couldn't have had the vote on Monday.
Yeah, and this was the week of a few firsts, and I'm pretty sure, and the historical political wonks out there can correct me on this, but I'm pretty sure this is the first time a government has filibustered their own throne speech.
This feels like something you'd see in like a political drama, like a House of Cards type thing, where they introduce a shitty bill that they don't actually want to pass just to try to like screw with their opposition. So I wouldn't have been surprised if it has happened somewhere, but it is weird too.
But on the throne speech though?
Yeah, at that level.
That's odd.
Well, Tuesday was the day of letters. A few weeks ago, we had a different set of letters around Site C. This time, it was competing letters to the speaker, sort of asking clarification questions. So Mike DeJong, the Liberal House leader at the time, just tried to clarify the roles of the speaker and essentially wanted him to tie the hands, let's say, of a future NDP speaker, getting the sort of rulings that, no, the speaker can't vote with the government on bills, for example, to pass them into law.
Basically kind of get some of the conventions kind of on record in a very formal way.
And Mike Farnworth, the NDP's House leader, sent his own letter basically going, what are you doing? Like, just do your job. You should just stick around, ignore their letter. We didn't get the response from Steve Thompson until Wednesday afternoon, but he basically dismissed them both by just, I think quite honestly saying, it's not my job as speaker to be your constitutional and legal expertise. You can find your own. I make the rules. And then he sort of cited what the rules were, but he said, this isn't definitive. These are conventions, and I'm not providing legal advice. This is just what's been written down. So that situation got diffused, but it was kind of interesting to see the Liberal play there to try to tie the hands. And it was called out pretty quickly by people like Maxwell Cameron from UBC, the political scientist, who just called it blatantly political and partisan. And Andrew Weaver called it politicking, in the worst, of course.
And the other news that came out that day is that Elections BC had been preparing for a snap election, which, not surprising at all, because up until a few minutes ago, there was a reasonable chance that the Lieutenant Governor could decide that, you know what, this really does need to go back to the people of BC. And, I made a point today, I've updated my voter registration because I'd moved since the last election, but it's not a surprise that they were getting ready to go for an election. And, that might actually pay off because, as we will be getting to in a bit, this isn't the most stable of governments. Yeah,
Elections BC is an arm-length body that can sort of do its own thing. It has its own budget that it reports independently. And so it just kind of looks at the situation and goes, there's a high probability there'll be an election. Those things take a lot of logistics to get lined up. And so they've actually been working essentially since they finished counting votes in late May to be ready to go. And it just sort of leaked out this week, which was just kind of amusing in the midst of everything else that happened. On Wednesday, that's when Horgan officially moved the confidence motion amendment to the throne speech. And other than that, in the legislature, not a lot exciting happened. What I think was more exciting, or more interesting for us at least, is the Tyee published an interview with the BC Conservatives director, whatever title that is, where they promised to essentially come out of hiding, and they said they're going to be ready to pounce on the Liberals whenever the next election comes. They're going to have a, quote, cutting edge, unquote, website, and they promised to have a new leader before the next election. Although, if that election had been called today, that wouldn't have happened, because it sounds like they're going to have a convention in the fall and then a leadership decision made after that.
Yeah, and, we've poked a lot of fun at the BC Conservatives, and I'm, curious whether or not their new website will have a post-1999 vibe to it. That'd be a nice improvement on their part, but I think the real question is, is there actually going to be any political appetite for this? And, there's a chance that Clark may have sufficiently alienated the base with the huge flip-flop, but in light of today, where they're now in opposition and will likely backtrack on their flip-flop, I don't see them having a huge amount of ability to kind of capitalize on the situation too much, especially because with another election fairly likely within the next year, where, I think the kind of anyone but the NDP are going to be wanting to stay fairly close to their, home turf for the Liberals at the moment.
The bigger news on Wednesday, I guess, though, was that Mike DeJong, this time in his finance minister hat, released unaudited fiscal statement trying to justify all the spending they'd done. And I don't know what else they were really trying to do with this other than...
Well, I think it was to answer the questions that the throne speech raised on, okay, you guys said we didn't have that much extra cash on hand to, do everything the NDP and the Greens wanted. You said that was fiscally reckless and everything. And now you've just endorsed all of their campaign promises. How do you square the circle? And this was DeJohn's attempt to do so.
And the answer was this $1.5 billion of an extra surplus that put it up to $2.8 billion. That creates a lot of room for spending.
Yeah, but it does also kind of raise the question of, how do you just find $1.5 billion?
It's in the mattress.
It must be a very big mattress. And for perspective, the BC budget's around $50 billion, give or take $5 billion, I think. So this is more than 1% of the budget here that just kind of appeared since the last election. And not the most credible approach where it's, suddenly this money's now available when they suddenly need to spend it.
Well, and they justify it through claiming higher GDP growth than expected, significantly higher, and just a lot of extra property transfer tax revenue that wasn't really predicted. Of course, these are all unaudited numbers, and so knowing that the Auditor General will release her final report on this probably in the next couple of weeks, they could have really just made anything up this week, as long as it was reasonably justifiable. Then, if it was going into an election, they wouldn't really have to worry about the Auditor General. Otherwise, now it might be that this magic surplus disappears and the NDP doesn't get to do it. Otherwise, this is just a whole bunch of money that now gets to go right into all of the promises Andrew Weaver and John Horgan made.
And then the final bit of news that happened on Wednesday was Clark gave this kind of odd press conference where she said if asked, she would tell the Lieutenant Governor that the NDP was too unstable to govern, but, wouldn't actually provide the advice on whether or not to dissolve the legislature and call an election or, invite someone else to form a government. And, if you heard a loud noise Wednesday, that was every constitutional expert in the country's head exploding at the same time, because literally that is job number one of a first minister, is to provide advice to the Lieutenant Governor or Governor General.
Yeah, our weird constitutional monarchy system, we don't have to deal with all of the intricacies until situations like this. But the job of the monarch or their representative in this day and age, when we don't chop their heads off, is to just do what the first minister says, either the prime minister or the premier, when it comes down to it. And so when the premier of BC goes, yeah, if I lose the confidence vote, I'll just go and tell her that. Well, you have to say something else. You have to say, I can't be premier anymore, number one, and here's some advice. She doesn't have to follow that advice, to be clear, because if Clark goes, you should go to an election, she goes, well, there's someone else who could probably pull it off. She's in her right to do, and that's what happened.
Yeah, nobody knows what's actually said in the room, but, 98% chance that's what was said.
But it was just such a weird, another attempt at signaling. Everyone sort of got the sense it was just her trying to cast aspersions and cast doubt once more publicly on this NDP Green Alliance and its stability. And it's not like the Lieutenant Governor lives in a hole like the groundhog and we only pull her out every year or every 4 years to do a ceremonial duty. She has Twitter. She's not very active on it, but she has Twitter, and I'm sure she was reading the news this last week, so her ultimate decision this night probably didn't take her that long, but they'd kind of drag these things out for ceremonial purposes. I was actually having to review the 2008 coalition fiasco at the federal level, and when Stephen Harper went to visit Michaëlle Jean to ask for prorogation, they dragged that meeting out for 2 hours before he finally came out and said he got what he wanted. And what came out later was that, yeah, she actually slowed it down just so it would imbue some symbolic importance to it, because it was a big decision. And if it was like 5 minutes, yeah, you get your way, it would look a little cheating.
Oh, yeah. Although there was really only one, constitutionally valid answer to that, but...
I disagree in 2008, but I think today was pretty clear.
Well, he hadn't lost the confidence yet, so, And at that point, when there is still a first minister who technically has the confidence at that moment, there really should be one person the Governor General is listening to. I think a lot of people didn't like that, but, the Constitutional Convention was pretty clear in the Harper case. And this case, the Constitutional Convention was also clear, and Clark either didn't know it or was trying to pretend like it was something else.
Well, and that brings us to today, where through most of the day, it was kind of just waiting for 5:30. There was the standard procedural stuff in the legislature with probably a bigger audience than it ever happened. So when the members gave their statements, for example, like an air show that's happening in Prince George, I think more people probably knew about that than had heard about it any other way. So good for them.
Well, if you're going to be doing one of the most watched filibusters in recent BC history, it's the sort of thing you might as well throw some bones to your constituencies.
We then had a pretty feisty question period, as they've been, but then it went into the quote-unquote debate over this confidence motion, which was people like former Health Minister Mary Polak thanking her campaign manager, some of her donors, I guess her auto dealer came up, just like random people she could think of that filled 20 minutes. I had to turn the feed off when I was at work in the background just because it was mind-numbingly boring. Not even in a soothing, meditative way, just what are you fucking doing? This is painful. But that's what I guess a filibuster is. And so that filled most of the afternoon in the legislature. And I tweeted this at the time, this could be the last, and it turns out it is the last speech these people will make as ministers of the crown, as government officials. Are they proud of themselves for that? I get that you've been told you have to fill this time, but write something good for it.
Yeah, well, I think the dignity went out when they filibustered their own throne speech.
So then it came down to the confidence vote at 5:30, which I couldn't listen to live. I was commuting at the time, but I heard a couple minutes later that Clark lost it, unsurprisingly. Within 20-30 minutes, she'd visited the Lieutenant Governor's house, and the rest is now history.
Clark was in with the Lieutenant Governor for quite a while. I think it was about an hour all set.
A little bit over.
Yeah, and then kind of stretch of time where not much happened. Clark came out, gave we're done talking, the Lieutenant Governor's, retired or whatever. And it's there'll be...
She left it really vague. It almost sounded like the Lieutenant Governor was going to spend the night on it and
yeah, we'd find out tomorrow.
Or after the long weekend. She's like, fuck it, I'm just going to enjoy Canada 150 stuff.
Yeah, it definitely did kind of hint at that. It was, yeah, super vague. Clark didn't really take any questions and made a brief statement that, she'd be around later if people were interested in her thoughts on the matter. That's just how it, once the Lieutenant Governor made a decision. But, just wasn't much was said or known, or not much indication was given one way or the other. And finally, John Horgan got a call to come to Government House, spent a little bit of time in there, and then finally came out. And, well, actually, I think he sent email blasts to everyone on the NDP mailing list before he came out and actually gave the speech. But
yeah, I guess in his press conference he mentioned that he texted one of his staffers to, hit send on the happy message, not the probably, he didn't say it this way, but I'm assuming there was a, we need a lot of money right now to fight an election kind of email ready to go. And they didn't have to send that one. Yeah,
but this does kind of ruin the show, the show a bit, and kind of the spoilers of this. And you saw the same thing when the Conservative leadership was announced. People knew that she had won because Maxime Bernier was told, was allowed back out on the floor, and he has a terrible poker face on it. So,
oh, John Horgan had no poker face walking out of Government House today.
Well, he
barely had one walking in.
Yeah, he had a pretty good smile on his face leaving the legislature to go over there. But the general point is, be nice if they could have just that little bit of we're just going to actually wait for the big announcement and not spoil it by kind of sending the message early.
A lot of the reporters on Twitter were pretty much assuming it was a done deal by the time Horgan had called, because the Lieutenant Governor doesn't really have reason to speak to leaders of the opposition other than to ask them to form government. There's speculation, and I thought of it as well, that maybe she just wants to get his opinion and get a sense from him if he could create a majority of MLAs to get the confidence of the House.
Yeah, in fact, that is kind of what's supposed to be done, is, the Lieutenant Governor is supposed to ask if they can have the confidence of the House.
And if he
not just pick a random person you seem like you'd make a good premier, and then let them test the confidence.
Well, and he's able to say yes, and at that point, it gets really dicey if the Lieutenant Governor goes, well, I don't believe you.
Well, and actually, we should probably circle back and mention one thing that happened between the confidence vote and this, is that the Speaker resigned too, and that kind of reopened the whole question on what's going to happen the Speaker going forward. And, there would be a reasonably plausible case that the Lieutenant Governor could look at the situation and be like, you know what? Once you take out the Speaker, who's supposed to vote for the status quo, that's not actually a workable government, and that needs to be sent to the people for an election. And I figure there's, maybe a 15% chance that we get an election before the Speaker resigned, or maybe 40 after, and still more likely than not that it was going to go to getting Horgan to form a government. But there's a decent chance that it would have gone the other way, especially after the Speaker resigned.
Well, and John Horgan didn't give any hints in his brief remarks after the Lieutenant Governor's House. He said, and he actually said it quite honestly for how the system works, the Speaker is an MLA who comes forward, who is elected by the House. He said we didn't know who would be Speaker until they were elected early last week, although at least the Liberals would have known. In this case, it felt like they knew. Yeah, and it's tough to say whether he's sort of feeling out his MLAs to get someone to step forward, or if he's really just going to let it play out and maybe someone who's interested will come forward.
So that's kind of just let it play out, because if nobody actually takes it up, then that is an unworkable legislation.
Then we're in 1908 Newfoundland again.
Yeah, and in that case, it would actually probably trigger an election.
So he'll probably be asking a few people, but just not publicly, and better respecting the idea that the Speaker should be someone who comes forward. But in terms of transition, it sounds like as of tomorrow, the NDP is going to get access to the government documents, so anything the Liberals haven't shredded in the last couple of weeks, not that I think they would, but that's sort of been the long-running joke, get handed over. And Beyond that, we
The
don't
emails
have...
that were only double deleted are now going to be able to be found.
And beyond that, we don't have much of a timeline. He said he's going to try and put together a cabinet as soon as possible. He's probably already got it in his head. He's had long enough that he could basically pick who he wants.
Yeah, it's been 7 weeks, roughly, since the election, so there's been time to think about these sorts of things.
And I assume he'll recall the legislature this summer to at least get a throne speech going and stuff happening.
I think it'd be slightly hypocritical if the Liberals would do this, but I wouldn't put it past them. If it, does drag out to September before he does call it back, I'd fully expect them to be hammering on the, you aren't testing the nomination of the House, this whole, you have such a unstable position, you need to test the confidence. So, he almost certainly will call it back before then.
So I guess going forward, the question is, how long will this alliance last between the Greens and the NDP? The Greens have seemingly made their bed and tied their knot as tight as they can to the NDP, especially after the antics, as it were, this past week. Now it's just a matter of how many of their promises, particularly proportional representation and some of the climate plans, can they get through before this all falls apart.
Yeah, and if I was weird, that's what I'd really be pushing on, especially the proportional representation, getting that locked in early, because this is a very unstable situation. And if it doesn't get locked in early and have the relevant legislation passed as, the first or second bill, you definitely run the risk of someone catching the flu and all of a sudden you're down that one critical vote, you lose confidence, triggers an election, and you're right back to square one.
We're also going to be watching for any by-elections, of course, because if anyone dies or has to resign, that's going to radically change the numbers at this point, because it's on such a balance. And I think the other thing to really watch is what's going to happen to the BC Liberals now. They've just put forward a throne speech that's largely cribbed from the now government, which I can't see them endorsing on that side of the aisle based on how bitter this last week has been. They're not suddenly going to go, oh, we were actually really committed to these ideas. We just wish you'd have agreed with us, but we want you to agree to them.
Yeah, they're going to have to find a way to walk it back, and the question there is, how do they do it? Do they just do a shameless pivot back to their old positions?
Well, they've already done one.
Do they do a sort of, we're not against these ideas in theory, it's just you guys have the worst implementation possible, so we're not going to support any of these? Or, what is...
Realistically, I think it's you dump Clark and you get a new voice.
Yes.
That's the easiest way to get it. It puts them in a very risky situation for a couple months.
And that's the thing, is the real question the Liberals have to be asking themselves is, does the current NDP Green Alliance have a shelf life of greater than or less than 3 to 4 months? Because if it's less than that, you don't want to be running a leadership race when the government's likely to fall and you're in an election. But if it goes any longer than that, having Clark around who just, endorse all these positions makes it very hard to walk it back. And I think their best bet is probably to dump Clark and have someone else come in who can distance themselves from the throne speech. And also one thing I don't think we'll see in this is very many kind of outsiders, non-MLAs, because, while it's traditional that a very safe seat resigns, it's such a balance on there. Maybe you don't want to be running a by-election if you don't have to, and I'm sure that's going to bias things towards the existing MLAs more than usual.
Well, one of the big problems with running a by-election, first, I think someone like Kevin Falcon, even though he said he doesn't want it, might put his hat in the ring, even though he's outside the legislature. But if an MLA has to resign, the government gets control of when the by-election is triggered, as far as I understand it. At least that's how it works at the federal level. So at that point, they don't have to trigger a by-election until sometime after the MLA has actually quit, which then, if it's a Liberal resigning, that gives the NDP government a bit of breathing room. So they're going to drag that out as long as they can. They're not going to call a by-election until the last day they have to, just so they can ram through bills that are sitting on this tied shelf waiting for just that.
I think the thing to really watch for in the next couple of weeks is what happens to the BC Liberals and Clark's leadership of it. And I imagine the knives are already coming out for her. For our next segment, we're having Stephen Carter join us to kind of tell us what the hell's happening with Alberta these days. For the 3 listeners out there who didn't also listen to the Strategists before they quit the week we started, more or less, Stephen Carter was one of the former hosts of that podcast. He's former chief of staff to Alison Redford and worked on the campaigns for Mayor Nenshi of Calgary, as well as Premier Redford.
Well, we're sitting down now, virtually, I guess, with Stephen Carter to get a little update from Alberta. We've done our bit on BC, or technically we will do our bit on BC because we're sort of waiting for literally anything to happen in Victoria. But in the meantime, you've been sort of off the podcast circuit for a few months now and leaving people like us and Boys in Short Pants and others to fill some big boots. So what have you been up to?
Trying to make money. As you know, the podcast game pays exactly zero. So getting out and actually running my company and doing campaigns for corporations principally. Campaigns in Canada just don't pay enough, guys. We should go find different work.
You've not been behind any new front runners for a certain leadership race?
No. The world of politics has been way more fun just to sit and watch and throw stones from the sidelines.
Well, that's why we wanted to bring you on, I guess, is to let you throw some stones. For starters, the big news, I guess, out of Alberta is there's this Jason Kenney won the Progressive Conservative leadership, and now there's this tentative agreement for the United Conservative Party. Maybe you could just run us through where that's at to today.
Well, I mean, right now, where it's at is that they have agreed that they will vote on it in July. I think it's July the 22nd. And they will vote on the principle of it. Now, the Progressive Conservative Party has a very easy bar to reach at 50% plus one, whereas the Wild Rose Party has a very difficult level to reach, and that's 75%. So what you're seeing right now is essentially a barnstorming where Jason Kenney is going around and trying to convince Wild Rose members to vote for the deal and for Progressive Conservative members to buy a membership in the Wild Rose Party. So the Wild Rose membership had dropped quite substantially, and now they're trying to flood with new people so that they can take over the Wild Rose, the same way that they really took over the Progressive Conservative Party. This is really a federal conservative takeover of both of these parties, with the expectation that the federal conservatives, who can do no wrong in Alberta, will be able to kind of rule the roost with a conservative agenda.
So the Progressive Conservatives have a pretty easy bar, and given Jason Kenney's easy victory there, there's probably no doubt they'll hit that 50%. But Wild Rose has a sort of history of being a bit temperamental, maybe let's say.
Extremely problematic. I mean, the people in the Wild Rose aren't people who enjoy being told what to do. They left the governing party. They left the Progressive Conservatives and said, no, you don't represent our principles. So they went off and they created this Wild Rose Party. And I don't agree with their principles. I disagree with a lot of the things that the Wild Rose does. But you can't dispute the fact that their principles are honestly held. And the only way now that Jason Kenney can effectively take over the Wild Rose is to take it over with a bunch of new people. Because I don't think that the existing members, the people who were campaigning against the PCs for years, are going to agree to the PC, to join under one conservative party again, which is what they left less than 10 years ago.
Now, they're out of power right now, which does kind of give a little more impetus for the Unite the Right. You don't think that's going to kind of overcome that reluctance to go back to the PCs?
The extreme right wing in Alberta has never been in power. The closest it got was in 1993 when Ralph Klein did his cuts. But that was 1993, and everybody was doing cuts then. I mean, balancing your budget became the thing that everybody did. The federal government did it. The federal liberals did it. So and then you had the Mike Harris PCs, the Ralph Klein PCs. Everybody balanced their budget. That's what 1990s were all about, austerity and that type of piece. But they weren't really even then in power. They didn't have as much power as they wanted. Through the 2000s, they've been out of power. The social conservatives have been out of power in Alberta for basically 20 years, since 1997. We haven't seen much in the way of social conservatism, and we've been moving the other way, which is, again, very similar to the rest of what the rest of Canada has been doing, embracing gay marriage, moving away from social conservatism towards kind of a fiscal conservatism or a more liberal kind of point of view. So these people have been out of power. So for them to make the choice to go back to power, they want to go back to power without compromise. And that was what made Stephen Harper so amazing when he did his particular merger, is he kind of convinced the social conservatives that they wouldn't have to compromise, and then completely compromised everything that the social conservatives wanted to see out of the federal government. And you didn't see issues like abortion or gay marriage or things like that really jump to the forefront under Stephen Harper. That will not be tenable in Alberta for the right wing, especially the Wild Rosers.
Do you see anyone of the potential leadership candidates trying to champion something like that, maybe? Or else, I guess the other flip side is there anyone sort of leading within the Wild Rose an organized no campaign to this merger?
There are lots of people. Jeff Callaway, who's the president of the Wild Rose, has had vocal opposition to the way the deal has been structured. There's a lot of rumblings. What you have to understand with the folks at the Wild Rose is that the constituency association volunteers, the grassroots level, is incredibly powerful, and they are so powerful that it's very difficult to kind of get them all moving in one direction. That has been the problem with the Wild Rose from the beginning, is that the grassroots party in Edmonton looks very different than the grassroots party in southern rural Alberta. It's not dissimilar from British Columbia, comparing the interior to Vancouver. Sure, you're all British Columbians, but it's a bit different, batshit crazy in both of those places.
So you touched on the path to victory. How likely is it, do you think, that Jason Kenney will actually be able to execute on it and get the 75% he needs from the Wild Rose?
Well, I think that's the biggest hurdle. If they can get that, I think, and I'm putting it kind of at 50-50 right now, that they're able to get to the 75%. The influx of members may be just too many for the existing Wild Rosers to kind of push back on. So this is essentially a takeover, the way that they said that when Alison Redford won the leadership in 2011, we took over the Progressive Conservative Party. So they're taking over the Wild Rose. I think they're going to get there. I know they're going to get there with the PCs. My personal dream, because I'm kind of a dick, is 72% in the Wild Rose, because then I really want to see Derek Fildebrandt try and figure out if he should cross the floor, given the his diatribe against the floor crossers from 2015. That would just make me happy. And really, politics exists to make me happy, guys. That's really what we're talking about here.
Well, on election night, Scott was hoping there would be a 43-43-1 split in BC.
No, 42-42-3.
Or 42-42-1. And we were actually sitting on that for a big chunk of the night until it finally broke to the split we got. So I guess good things can happen. Bringing up Derek Fildebrandt, he's sort of expressed now his desire to lead the United Conservative Party. We also have Jason Kenney, who's obviously in the running for it. And you mentioned also Doug Schweitzer. Maybe give us the rundown on who the fuck Doug is, whether Derek's got any chance, or if Jason's just going to run away with it now that he's flooding everyone with memberships.
So I'll give you the straight up analysis first, and then I'll give you the conspiracy theory after. So Brian Jean is definitely running for this leadership. He wants to be part of it. He's the former MP from Wood Buffalo who essentially just assumed the mantle of leadership after Danielle Smith and the other MLAs crossed to Jim Prentice's Progressive Conservatives. And Brian Jean did better, I think, than anybody expected in the 2015 election. And frankly, he could have won the election if Jim Prentice had looked to him in the debate instead of looking to Rachel Notley. So Brian is kind of a good guy who's going to get screwed by this process, because the other three, Doug Schweitzer, was going to seek the leadership of the Progressive Conservative Party and ultimately dropped out to end up on Jason Kenney's team. And Derek Fildebrandt has been essentially the undermining force for the United Conservative Party within the Wild Rose. He's the one who's agitating for the merger the most and undermining Brian Jean as the leader. So you've got this two bigger names, Brian Jean and Jason Kenney, both from federal politics. And then you've got these two lesser known names, Derek Fildebrandt and Doug Schweitzer. Schweitzer purports to be kind of more the middle of the road, the more progressive side of the Progressive Conservatives. Personally, I think that's a bunch of bullshit. He came out with a let's lower taxes platform the other day, and these are let's lower taxes in the lowest tax jurisdiction in Canada with a $10 billion plus deficit. Actually, I think it's $12 billion today. That's ridiculous. If we had your taxation scheme, if we just took BC's taxes and dropped them into Alberta, we'd have $9 billion more in revenue. $9 billion goes a long ways towards eliminating that $12 billion deficit. So anyway,
careful, you're sounding like the orange apologist there.
Don't get me started on the orange apologist. It makes me crazy. No, but we have a fiscal problem, and you guys run into it too, a little bit in British Columbia. Whenever you start relying on royalties to balance your operating budget, you really put yourself in a difficult spot. Royalties in gaming are kind of the crack cocaine in British Columbia and Alberta, and not the best thing in the world. So I just think that you've got this Doug Schweitzer character who's now going to campaign as the progressive person, but he's done nothing actually to show that he's got a progressive point of view. Derek Fildebrandt is going to campaign as the furthest right wing of everybody. He's the crazy motherfucker. So he is going to go as far to the right as possible and bring in all of those right wing people. And what I think is fascinating about this, and this is where I start to sound a little bit like a conspiracy theorist, is that Doug Schweitzer and Derek Fildebrandt both worked on Jason Kenney's campaign. They've both been working on the Unite Alberta project from the very first day that Jason launched it. In fact, from well before that. So you've got these two guys that ultimately, I think, are just there to fold their votes into Jason Kenney. And Jason Kenney can then say, I brought in people from the Progressives through Doug Schweitzer, and I brought in people from the Conservatives through Derek Fildebrandt, and now I have built the big tent. And so that's his play. That's what he's ultimately going to do. And so you'll see Schweitzer and Fildebrandt fold their votes into Kenney through the balloting process of the leadership in October.
With the leadership process of the yet-to-be formed party, is it going to be a delegated convention, or is it going to be a ballot like we saw with the federal Conservatives?
I think it's going to be more like the federal Conservatives with its 100-point piece. They're still working that out a little bit. One member, one vote is kind of this foundational principle in Alberta politics. Of course, it's as easy to manipulate as any other system. So everybody thinks that they'll wind up in a point system to kind of balance off the strength that Kenney's got in urban Calgary. So we'll see. I mean, I think that the point system has a degree of sense for them. I think that the Brian Jean's really pushed and demanded that. I don't think Jason Kenney has any problem with that because I think he knows he's going to win regardless of what system they put in place.
If this Derek, Doug, Jason secret alliance is true, or even if it's not, but Jason still has the best chance, what do you think Brian Jean needs to do to have any chance or to be in this game?
Find pictures of Jason Kenney with someone who he shouldn't be with. There's basically no way that Jason Kenney loses this dude.
Just go dirty.
I mean, you got to go dirty. I mean, the background files on Jason Kenney are extensive. Everybody's got them. Everybody knows what his weaknesses are. And I think the media is willing to report them. They didn't cover him as much when he was running for the PC leadership. I think this United Alberta thing, or UCP, well, really, what's wrong with the UCP? How can conservatives be so bad at naming things? UCP? Come on. Guy's killing me. Right after the crap party? Like, acronyms matter. Pay attention. Anyways, I think that Jason Kenney's got such a lock on it that Brian Jean is probably secretly hoping that this fails so that he can retain his leadership.
Well, crossing the bench, I guess first assuming the UCP gets off, led by Jason Kenney, barring any magic surprises, what do you think this means for the Notley NDP going into the next election?
Well, Corey Hogan, my good friend from the Strategists podcast, likes to call this the war for civilization. So you've got a non-existent center that's trying to be reconstructed, but really doesn't have much time. And so you've got the big battle between, the NDP and the right. And the right is basically defining itself as the really quite far right. So anybody who's not with them is against them. So people that were that may be inclined to vote to the right wing are being told that they're not conservative enough. And this is one of the failings of the right wing in Alberta. They almost make you take a blood test. Are you conservative enough? Let's see, test your blood. And they don't seem to understand that getting more people to vote for you is actually the objective. The NDP, on the other hand, is saying, well, holy shit, if we move to the center, if we move and we become that kind of prairie populist NDP that isn't really ideologically bound, that looks more like Rory Romano than it looks like Bob Rae, then we think that we can bring in a structure of government that Albertans will resonate with. And the evidence of that is the last time they were given a choice, Albertans were given the choice between Brian Jean and the Wild Rose, or Rachel Notley and the NDP, and overwhelmingly we chose the NDP. So the NDP is very bullish on a Kenney-led United Conservative Party, especially a Kenney-led United Conservative Party that continues to do stupid-ass things like throw punches at the middle. Tell the middle that, the middle is the NDP light. Like, okay, go for it. I don't know what polling you're looking at, but Albertans really aren't that right wing. No more so than British Columbians are right wing. We are Canadians. We're centrist. We want a good healthcare system. We want a good education system. We want roads that we can drive on. These are things that are important. And by God, why haven't you guys done that whole 4-lane highway back from Kamloops to the Alberta border? How long does that take? Why is it taking so long?
There's a lot of mountains in the way.
I'm just saying, I drive that highway a lot. I could use a little bit of help.
Fair enough.
But speaking of BC, like the classic thing to do here, if you're, not the NDP, is to form a big tent, not NDP party. And right now that happens to be the Liberals. We'll see how long that lasts. But why hasn't that kind of mentality sunk in Alberta? Is this like a cultural thing, or why is the drive to the right rather than the center?
Well, because the people who have the most momentum, right? Like what happened last time was that the center collapsed. So the Progressive Conservative Party under Ed Stelmach and Alison Redford had moved to the center. Jim Prentice started to shift it to the right. And as he was starting to make that shift, all the weakening that had happened after 44 years of rule just collapsed all at once. And everybody moved to the NDP. Therefore, the inclination to rebuild the center isn't there, because that's what just collapsed. And there are really a lot of right-wingers who say things like the Federal Conservative Party in Alberta gets 300,000 votes more than the Progressive Conservatives used to get. And the reason for that is the Progressive Conservatives weren't right-wing enough. And, That's a flawed analysis on many levels, like all the levels, really. It doesn't account for different voting. Like, you don't get anything from the federal government. The federal government's not dropping a CF-18 in your lap, right? Like, it's just, you don't get things. When the provincial government is healthcare, human services, education, post-secondary education, and all our roadway systems. That's stuff you need. So you can see that in the same way that we vote more left at the municipal level, because it turns out you have to invest money to make sure that the sewers work the right way. That's an important thing, because you actually don't want your sewers to back up. So you pay the money to make sure the sewers work. You pay the money to make sure the healthcare system works. You don't have to pay money to make sure the defense budget works or the fisheries Canada works. I mean, who the hell cares? We can vote conservative and it doesn't impact us at all. So there's different reasons and rationales for voting. The analysis that the Wild Rose and the right wing put forward is, we got to move right wing, we'll get more votes. I see absolutely no evidence of that. So I think that Hogan's view that the battle of civilizations is coming and that it favors the NDP, I think that that's the right analysis. And I think that the NDP is just sitting back and laughing their asses off at the United Conservative Party. And every day that Jason Kenney's followers, buy a bunch of red hats with "Make Alberta Great Again," which literally they are selling those hats today.
Wow, I haven't been home in a while.
No, you got to look at my Twitter feed. They are selling "Make Alberta Great Again" hats because they have the political intelligence of gnats. They are dumb, and they're going to do this. And every time they do it, Hogan just does this little victory lap of his office. Now, he's a nonpartisan civil servant, so he's going to be really mad that I said that. But he still does a little lap. It's just going to be our little secret.
Well, bringing it back to the points about the centrists, there are always those kind of people who, for whatever reason, couldn't stomach the NDP, figure they're too far left, obviously won't stomach the right wing, and they always call for, the new centrists. And there's the shell of the Liberal Party. There's the Alberta Party of one person as well. And I guess they had 300 people show up in Red Deer last weekend. Do you think there's any more movement to it than that? Or is it really just sort of, neophytes hoping for something that will never occur?
So the way I like to put this is that there are about 5,000 activists in the Progressive Conservative Party who are now without a home, right? They have nothing to do. Jason Kenney's team took over their constituency associations. Kenney's team has taken over and is really pushing people who are centrist out of the party. So those people are sitting around kind of going, okay, well, what should we do now? And what they should do now is go to a center party. The question is which one? And Stephen Mendel, the former mayor of Edmonton, former health minister under Jim Prentice, has been influential in creating this kind of move to amalgamate or merge or create the Alberta Party to be the center option. This is kind of where I've been playing a little bit, not recently, but in 2014, 2015, I was there already trying to build the Alberta Party as a thing that could meet the expectations of the middle centrist voter. The challenge with that is, as the BC Conservative Party knows, getting oxygen when there's two big fish is really tough. The three-party system works well when you have enough geography to have kind of two parties that fight over here and two parties that fight over there and two parties that fight over there. The three parties all fighting together in one small little area, it hasn't worked for the BC Conservatives. It's not going to work as well for the Alberta Party either. Having said that, I do think that there's a possibility that if they had a leadership, if they had something that gave people the opportunity to participate instead of just simply saying, here we are, help us any way we can. Like, I think that opportunity exists, but I'm not entirely sure they're going to be in a position to take advantage of it.
Do you see any leaders coming forward for that besides Stephen Mandel that you mentioned?
Well, I think that that's ultimately the problem. There are not a tremendous number of people stepping forward into leadership positions. I suspect this is the same throughout Canada. We all bemoan the quality of our elected representatives, and yet none of us are stepping up. The quality of people that are stepping up are just, they're not there. And for someone like myself, who's constantly looking for the next person to try and elevate into a position of power, who can actually affect change throughout our society, I'm pretty disappointed that we're not getting as many women, as many people who are college professors, entrepreneurs. They're just not stepping forward to serve in government the way we'd like them to.
Are you going to be stepping forward anytime?
I can't imagine. No,
Sure.
no. I step forward by working behind the scenes. My political involvement is to create the strategies that get people elected.
Well, do you have anything else you want to throw in there, or else you can, plug your Twitter and other things you're working on?
Yeah, I mean, if people want to spew hate at me, it's at Carter_AB. If you want to throw praise at me, it's at Corey Hogan. And if you have nothing to say at all, it's at Zane Belgi. So I look forward to hearing the interaction from the people who listen to the podcast.
And check out the next season of The Strategists in September, right?
Yeah. I can't get Zane to do shit. He's lazy. He is just so lazy. And Corey's bound to get fired pretty soon. He's been there almost a year. So he'll get fired pretty soon.
Thanks for this.
Okay. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Okay, and for our quick takes, first up, the Supreme Court today dismissed two separate appeals of rulings on the Site C Dam. The Prophet River First Nation and the West Moberly First Nation had both been trying to use constitutional arguments to block construction on the Site C Dam, saying it's their land and they weren't properly consulted. And both had made it, set one through the BC court system, one through the federal court system. They both made it to Court of Appeal. Every level they seem to have lost. And now the Supreme Court has said they're not even going to hear the case.
Yeah, so I think it's important here to kind of not read too much into it. The Supreme Court gets a lot of cases and they don't take up most of them. But, with this case, if all the lower courts had ruled one way, it's not surprising that they didn't look at this anymore.
Yeah, I think this means the only other barriers I can see before Site C are the review that's planned. John Horgan promised to do a number of reviews, and that's what could kill the Site C Dam, because the Greens are adamantly against it, versus the BC Liberals have been very strongly for it. At this point, it almost seems like Clark's been trying to push it along even through this sort of caretaker position that maybe it'll be a done deal.
Well, it's a multi-billion-dollar, multi-year infrastructure project. It's not really a done deal until it's actually up and running. But to be fair to Clark, you can't really put something like this on hold while you sort out who's going to form government, because construction delays are very costly, and especially on a project that big, if you just have all those crews idle for a while you spend nearly 2 months sorting out who's going to be in government, it's, that just adds a whole bunch of more costs onto the already big price tag. So, there wasn't any new decisions there, so I think that's a fairly okay implementation of the Caretaker Convention. But, we'll just have to kind of watch and see what happens to the review on it, because the NDP's been against it, but not strongly against it, and I'm sure the blue-collar union base would be happy to see the project go through. Moving on to federal politics, Justin Trudeau kind of had what it was described as a quote-unquote end of the year, which I guess mostly refers to the end of the parliamentary session.
It's like a school year. He's still a teacher, right?
I guess so. Anyway, he had this end of the session, I'm going to call it, because it's June. No, I'm not trying to call it the end of the year. press conference where he had some interesting responses to a few queries, particularly on electoral reform, where he said it was difficult that he killed it, and tried to paint it as though, no, he was always for ranked ballots all along, and it's everyone else's fault that they didn't know that and give in to his whim on it.
His comments were just sort of, nothing was surprising except that he actually verbalized them. And that was sort of the thread through this whole thing. This is one of those times when I strongly agree with an Andrew Coyne piece. It became titled, Trudeau's Petulant Tone-Deaf Performance, a Remarkable Milestone. And he highlights that and two other sort of issues Trudeau brought up as points where he's just blaming the opposition for things that are entirely his own making. So on exceeding his deficit projections, he blames the Conservatives for hiding a deficit when, in Coyne's words at least, no, reputed economists were really saying Harper left us with a deficit. It was a round balance. It wasn't a big surplus for sure, but it wasn't the $13 billion deficit that Trudeau's sort of claiming that he had to deal with.
Yeah, and you don't get to preside over one of the biggest peacetime expansions of a government budget in a growing economy and get to play it's everyone else's fault for the deficit card.
And then Trudeau was also blaming the Conservatives in the Senate for making the Senate so hard to deal with, and he needs to get more independent Liberals in there, or more independents, let's say. And he's saying the Conservatives are too partisan, when I guess there's an Eric Grenier calculation that the Conservatives voted against the Liberals 70% of the time, which is pretty partisan, but the quote-unquote independents voted with the government over 94% of the time, which I guess 6% breaking ranks is actually pretty non-partisan in modern partisan politics in Canada and the States, but it's still pretty ideologically coherent.
Yeah, I don't think anyone really ever saw the independent senators as truly independent. Like, you had the old cohort who were appointed under Martin and Chrétien and all the previous Liberal prime ministers who, they're Liberals. You can plaster over the red and the L's, but they're Liberals, and everybody knows that, so that's no surprise. And then, it's not an entirely surprising thing that a Liberal appointment process that was designed by the Liberals, had the board appointed by Liberals, recommended people who saw, things more or less in line with the Liberals.
Well, and this decision to kick the Liberals out of the Liberal caucus in the Senate was Trudeau's. It was entirely his decision to go down this path, to create the Senate in this Hydra monster way, and now he's living with the consequences and trying to blame it on others. And to bring it back to the electoral reform, it's there where he's blaming the NDP for being too stuck on proportional representation. He's blaming the Conservatives for being too stuck on the current system, and no one wanted to compromise and take his system, which also just says...
That's not a compromise. If everybody just does what the Prime Minister says, that's not a compromise.
And the other problem is, he totally ignores the fact 90% of the experts who showed up at the committee didn't just not recommend ranked ballots. They said it was a bad system because it can create even worse and more disparate results if you're trying to get a system where the vote share matches the distribution of seats. Ranked ballots is almost the only system worse than first past the post, because you get these cases where everyone just kind of defaults to Liberals, except maybe in an election where everyone's pissed off at the Liberals, which could happen in this kind of situation when you get this arrogant. But I guess the whole point is this press conference was once again Trudeau shooting himself in the foot one more time. It was his choice to call it. It was his choice to answer these in the words he did. It's been, I guess, a couple months since we've had him put his foot in his mouth. Maybe it was overdue.
Yeah, the whole thing is just really tone deaf. Like, we're getting fairly close to the halfway point on his mandate, and just blaming the previous government for everything, especially when it was very clearly his choice on the budget, and then blaming everyone else on the electoral reform stuff. It's just one of those things that, kind of, what was he thinking? And just the whole thing just seemed out of touch. And that, I think, is kind of the big risk for Trudeau here. If that continues, his big advantage in the last campaign was that he did a good job connecting with people, and if he's losing touch at, year and a half in, or nearly 2 years, it's one of those things. It's like, yeah, will that necessarily be there when everyone goes back to the polls next time?
Well, now he has a whole summer of kayaking, showing up at Pride events, and doing what he's good at. So perhaps that'll be his bounce. Well, and through the summer, the other person who's going to be trying to make a name for himself is Andrew Scheer. And interestingly, he came out with a sort of new policy direction, or maybe it's leaning on some of their historic positions, depending how you read it, on free trade with China. And interestingly, the Conservatives had decided, no, they're not the party of free trade anymore. They're the party of labor standards and working conditions.
I think it's more a case of they're not the party of free trade with China, and they're latching onto a convenient talking point on that. Because this is definitely a departure from the more traditional talking point of that, these sorts of trade deals that, are good for the economies of both sides, and, it leads to higher working standards typically for the, third world country and other countries we sign this with. And like the TPP, for example, had a whole bunch of labor standards provisions that would have raised labor standards in a bunch of the less developed countries that were signatories to that deal. And, that's the kind of typical talking point on that. So it's a little interesting that Scheer went this route, but, the real thing is, I don't think Scheer sees China as nearly as friendly a country to have a free trade deal with, and, might have made more sense from at least a more traditional line of attack to, talk about how China doesn't have rule of law and secure property rights, and those sorts of things are generally bad for trade and not the sort of things you want to be having on a country you're entering into a free trade deal with.
And just to insert a little breaking news that doesn't make any sense at all when you're not listening to this as we're recording it, but I just got the email from John Horgan's campaign staff, obviously, titled, "We Did It," sort of implying that he's met with Judith Guichon, and I'm assuming that means he's premier, but we'll talk about that fully in a bit, which you've already listened to, because that's how we're doing it. But I just wanted to squeeze in some breaking news.
Yeah, I expect this to be kind of the China thing to be kind of a recurring theme going forward for Scheer. There's the questions over the Norsat deal, and, Trudeau's been making noise about a free trade deal with China, and, well, their big market, there's maybe better places to try and get a free trade deal with first. So I could kind of see that being a kind of more persistent line of attack for Scheer going forward. And, trying to frame them, and, well, Russia too is probably, the new Canadian geopolitical rivals that this government is too friendly with.
I think it's just interesting to look at it on the alternate universe where Maxime Bernier had become leader of the Conservative Party, and I don't think this is the differentiate ourselves from the Liberals kind of path he would have taken. He would have been on the, maybe, let's get even more free trade. Let's not even worry about the labor standards. Let's go full libertarian, and that'll solve everything. But instead we got Harper 2.0, so we're going to get the sort of compromise policies that try to differentiate themselves from the Liberals to try to make the Conservatives a sellable brand.
And since you brought up Harper, it is worth remembering that the Harper government had some kind of frosty moments in their relationship with China, so this isn't out of the question for the Conservative Party. And that has been Politos. Find links to the stories mentioned in the show notes at politos.ca. Make sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at PolitosPod. Leave us a review and let us know what you think. Support the show and join the Politos community at patreon.com/Politos. And if you have any ideas for the show, feel free to send them to us. Thanks for listening.